Okay, students, here's part 2. This is part 2 of our estimating sums and differences of fractions using benchmark fractions. So let's start right away, part 2. Let's look at this first word problem. It says for a fruit salad, Jenna combined 3/8, 7/8, and 3/4, a cup of apples. So about how many cups of fruit are in this salad? Well, let's look at it. Let's say 3/8. We're going to figure out what that's closest to. We're going to think 7/8, and we're going to think 3/4. Well, 3/4 is easy because 3/4 is 3/4. 7/8. Well, what's half of 8? 4. So this is greater than 4. So I'm going to think, well, it could either be 3/4 or it could be 1 whole. Now remember what Miss Ayala said. Well, how many away is that numerator from the denominator? Good, it's 1 away, so it's going to be closer to 1 whole. Then we have 3/8. Let's find our half. What's half of 8? Good, 4. So 3 is definitely less than 4. So 3/8 is going to turn into 1/4. So now we have 1/4, 1, and 3/4. So let's see, let's add those together. We have 1/4 plus 3/4 plus 1 whole. What would that give us? Well, 3/4 and 1/4 equals 4/4, and 4/4 equals a whole. So what is 1 plus 1? Equals 2. So my answer for 1/4 plus 3/4 plus 1 equals 2. So 3/8, 3/4, and 7/8 equal 2. Okay, now let's move this out of the way. Let's check for reasonableness on some estimating. So let's pull this up so we can see a little bit bigger. Okay, first one. Let's look at the first one. It says 1/3 plus 1/2, and then it's comparing it to 1. So let's think to our... Remember what Miss Ayala said about unit fractions, that those will be closer to 0. So for 1/3, I'm going to think 0, and then a half is a half. And then it's comparing it to 1 whole. Well, 1/2 and 1 whole, which one's greater? Absolutely. 1 is greater. So for this one, that is the way we would put our sign. Let's try number 2. Okay, looking at number 2, it says 3/5 plus 1/2. And it's comparing it to 1 whole. Okay, so well, a half is a half. Now let's think 3/5. Well, remember, Miss Ayala always wants you to think of your half. So half of 5 would be 2.5. So I can think of that as greater than a half. So I can say, well, it's not half. If it's greater than a half, it would be 3/4. So then I have 3/4 plus 1/2 compared to 1 whole. So let me get some more room here. Remember what we said about 3/4. Well, I can break 3/4 into 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. Then I'll add on the half. What is 1/4 and 1/4? Put together is 2/4, which equals 1/2. So now these two are a half. So I have a half plus this half plus the 1/4. So what is a half and a half together? That equals 1 whole. So 1 and 1/4 is absolutely bigger than 1 whole. So I would make sure to mark the sign this way. Now let's try this next one. It says, now we're doing some differences. We have 3/4 minus 1/8 compared to 1/2. Okay, let's look at 3/4. Well, 3/4 is 3/4. And 1/8, I want you to think of your benchmark fraction. So you have 0, 1/4, 1/2. It's closer to what? Remember, unit fractions will be closer to 0. So that would be like minus 0 to 1/2. So then, of course, this means nothing. I have nothing to subtract to. I have 3/4 and 1/2. Well, which is greater? 3/4. So here my sign would go that way. Okay, let's try this next one. Okay, let's say we have 8/10 minus a half compared to a half. Now, 8/10, well, first thing I'm going to think of is, well, what's half of 10? Half of 10 is 5. This is definitely bigger than 5. So it can't be a half. I'm going to see it as 3/4. So 3/4 minus a half compared to a half. So let me make some more room here, look at it, and think to ourselves, well, what I know about fractions is that 1/2 is the same as 2/4. Since I have fourths already, I'm going to put the 1/2 and change it into the fourths. So then I have 3/4 minus 2/4, and 3/4 minus 2/4 would give me 1/4 as compared to 1/2, and which of course is bigger, 1/4 or 1/2? That's right, 1/2. Okay, so let's estimate the sum of 5/9 and 4/7. So 5/9. Remember, first thing I have to do is I have to think of what would be my half. Now, a 9 is an odd number, so it's kind of weird, but half of 9 would be 4.5, and 5/9 is close to a half, so I'll leave that as a half. And 4/7, well, half of 7 would be like 3.5, so 4/7 is close to a half also. So I would say that 5/9 plus 4/7 would be close to 1, because 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1/2. Okay, let's try this one. It says that Charlie said the difference, now remember what difference, it means we're going to be subtracting. The difference between 8/10 and 1/5 is about 1/4. Okay, so let's take our 8/10. First thing let's do, let's think it's not going to be close to 0 because 8/10 is not a unit fraction. So let's figure out our half. Half of 10 is 5, so 8 is greater than the half, so 8 we'll think of as 3/4 because that's greater than a half. And so 1/5 is a unit fraction, so 1/5 we're going to think of as 0, because that's close to 0. So 3/4 minus 0 is going to give me 3/4. So 3/4 does not equal 1/4. Therefore, this is not reasonable. Charlie was not right in saying that it was going to be about 1/4. Let's try some bigger numbers. What if we had 3 9/10 minus 1 2/5? Well, my whole numbers will stay my whole numbers, so 3 is 3. Now 9/10. 9/10 is almost close to 10/10, so I'm going to think of 9/10 as 1/2. So now, so far on this side, 3 plus 1, I've got 4 as my whole. So on this side I have 1, and let's see, 2/5. Half of 5 would be, again, that's a weird one because it's odd, but half of 5 would be 2.5. So I'm going to see that as close to 1/2. So now I have on this side 1/2. I'm supposed to do 4 minus 1.5. Let me get some more room here. So for 4 minus 1 1/2, well, I know that I'm going to be dealing with halves. So to make a whole, because I have to put something here. So to make a whole would take away, let's see, 4 would have to turn into 3. And to make a whole in fractions, that would be 2/2, because 2/2 would make my whole. Then just subtract straight out. 2 minus 1 is 1. And my whole number is 3 minus 1 is 2. So 3 9/10 minus 1 2/5 will equal 2.5. Now I know that I had to use halves because my denominator here was 2, which means my denominator here had to be 2. So I had to have 2 out of 2 to equal the whole, because I broke up one of a whole into fraction. So if I had to break up, let's see, the number 4, and I was going to subtract 2 and 4/8, well, same thing here. I'd have to look at my denominator. Denominator is 8. So to have a whole, it would have to be 8/8. So this whole number 4 would turn to 3, and 8/8 would be the other whole. So here, straight subtraction. Denominators are the same. 8 minus 4 is 4. 3 minus 2 would be 1. Let's try one more example for estimating differences. Let's say we had 1 7/8 minus 1 1/2. Okay, so on this side, well, I have my 1, 7/8. What benchmark would that be closest to? Well, let's check. What is half of 8? 4. So my 7 is definitely greater than the half, and it's very close to the whole because it's only 1 away. So I wouldn't say half. I wouldn't say 3/4 because it's only 1 away. So I'm going to think of it as 1 whole. So on this side, I have 1. And I have another whole, so 1 plus 1 equals 2. So now I have 2 minus 1 1/2. Don't have to do too much to that side because 2 minus 1 1/2, half is a half, so I have to just do the straight subtraction. And in order to do that, I have to make sure I have something here. So check the denominator. Denominator's 2, so my whole would be 2 over 2. So in order for me to get a fraction, I have to take that whole to make it into a fraction. So 2 is going to become 1. And then straight subtraction down, the denominator is going to stay 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. So my answer is 1/2. So the easy steps that I want you to remember when you're estimating any fractions, step 1 is I want you to figure out, is it a unit fraction? And if it's a unit fraction, I want you to think of it as 0, close to 0. The second thing I want you to check is what's the half? So if your fraction is 7/12, you're going to think, well, half of 12 is 6, and this is greater than the half. So if it's greater than the half, it's going to equal 3/4. So that's what I want you to look at as you're doing these benchmark fractions. You have to think to yourself these 3 steps. And the third step is looking at your fraction and thinking about what your whole is. Let's say if you had 5/6, well, that is so close to being a whole, which is 6/6. So there I'm going to think of it as 1. So there's 3 things you need to look at. You have to see first, is it a unit fraction? And if it's a unit fraction, it's going to be 0. Then you're going to check for what your half is. So whatever your fraction is, find your half. And if it's greater than the half, it'll be 3/4. If it's less than the half, it'll be 1/4. And then the next step is to check for your whole. You'll look at your fraction and see how close it is to a whole, because 6/6 is the whole for 5/6, and it's so close, so that'll equal 1. And if you can memorize these 3 things while you're estimating fractions using these benchmarks, you're going to do fantastic on these. So just remember, unit fraction, yes or no, what's the half, and is it close to a whole? Then you'll be able to figure out where on your line it belongs. So again, here's my 0, my 1. Right in the middle is my half. I have my 1/4, and I have my 3/4. Okay, guys, now it's your turn. Go have some fun.